2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. Alright guys, Ian here from 79 Sports Therapy. So today we're looking at shoulder injuries, and in particular, like what we do in terms of rehab for them. You know, it's like when you're going to get a shoulder injury, we always think about it being that glenohumeral joint, the ball and socket joint, and we go straight to that rotator cuff. So we start doing our banded sort of rotator cuff work, up here. For us, we've got to stop, think about that entire context, think about the entire sort of shoulder girdle, and start to think a little bit more about scapular position as a bigger part of that rehab, because the position of that scapula is as important, if probably not more important, than actually what we do in terms of the rotator cuff. All right, so let's think about the anatomy of the shoulder girdle. So obviously we've got the wait a minute. All right, so we've got the glenohumeral joint. So it's this ball and socket joint in here. Obviously humeral, humerus, so this bone here. Gleno, it refers to the glenoid, which is actually the socket, which is the socket that the ball of the humeral head sort of sits into. Obviously, up top, we've got your AC joint. So this one here, your acromioclavicular joint. So acromio basically refers to this, which is the acromion. That's that top of the shoulder blade, right? And then obviously the clavicular, our collarbone running forwards. And then obviously sternoclavicular joint, so this one attached to the sternum, so the sternum sits here, so sternum, then the clavicle, working then back our way through. Obviously what people sort of don't think about is then the scapulothoracic joint as being part of this greater sort of complex, right? So the scapulothoracic joint, what's it mean? Well, scapula, thoracic cage, right? So in here, we've got our ribs. So our ribs are running through here, and our scapula is running on top of those ribs. That's our scapulothoracic joint. That's what dictates the position of this in that greater context. And you're kind of thinking, why is this important? Well, the scapula, that's the socket. So the scapula forms the gleno, so the glenoid, the actual socket of that ball and socket joint. You start moving this around, this doesn't know where it's sitting. So we can start to see why scapular position really affects that glenohumeral joint, right? As soon as we start to move that socket around, that ball has got no real reference point, or no real solid point of reference to say, this is where I am in space. This is what we then need to do in terms of manipulating my position, in terms of sort of creating a good congruent, good deep joint for movement and for processes, for force to actually occur off of. So as soon as we start to fix this, give this a good point of reference, we can start to affect the way in which the humeral head references off of that. And that's massively important when we sort of start to then think about the greater context, right? So as soon as we start moving, that scapula has got to move. So as we come up and out to the side, that scapula is creating movement with that. If it moves in a good, solid, consistent movement, the humeral head is kind of going, cool, I know where I'm at, I know where you're at, we can move together and we can get that whole process, that whole movement sort of squared away. As soon as that scapula starts to move in an inconsistent sort of direction, in an inconsistent sort of manner, then that humeral head all of a sudden doesn't know where it's going. So that process, that sort of very, very sort of simple arm up and out to the side, becomes actually a little bit of a fight of us pulling that humeral head around, and it kind of going, what, my buddy over here isn't moving as well as it kind of should do. So I now don't know where I'm moving in sort of relation to him. So I'm now in my own space. That humeral head then starts to bash around within the socket. That's then when we then start to see some of those injuries that we see. So things like our sort of subacromial sort of impingement, for example. So I guess we also shouldn't really sort of neglect the effect that scapular position has on our rotator cuff. And again, this is where that sort of that theme harks back to, should we just mindlessly crack on with our sort of rotator cuff exercises, or think about that sort of greater context, right? With our scapula, if we think about, sort of poor posture, we're constantly thinking about that, what we refer to as an upward rotation, right? So an upward rotation is very sort of simple. It's that shoulder sort of popping sort of up and forwards. We can kind of see those people sort of walk around in that position. You may well sort of do so yourself. Now, if we think about that as a sort of position, well, that's an internally rotated position, right? So the scapula has gone up and forwards. The humeral head has then rolled forwards in the joint, and all of a sudden, we're internally rotated, right? So our internal rotators are part of that rotator cuff. They're all nice and short. They're holding on for grim death, kind of going, well, I'm not going to let go. You're putting me in a shortened position. All of a sudden then, in that position, all those external rotators, so all these muscles on the back, all these muscles on the back of the scapula that sort of wrap around the back of the humeral head, they're going, oh, brute, all of a sudden, I'm really, really long. I'm not supposed to be this long. I'm supposed to be more taut than this. So I'm going to sort of fire up and try to bring you back into that sort of more externally rotated position. So we get this sort of dual threat of all those internal rotators being very, very tight, very, very short, because we're putting them in a shortened position. And then all of those external rotators being very, very long and shortening down into a shortened position. All of a sudden, we're kind of going, oh yeah, my shoulder feels really, really tight. Oh, I better do some rotation, because obviously that's my rotator cuff, right? Is it your rotator cuff? Or is it actually scapular position, that scapular position pulling you up and forwards, causing that sort of disruption within that rotator cuff system, and you actually then losing that ability to sort of apply good, consistent force through there? So I guess the other structure as well we've got to think about within this context is definitely our thoracic cage, or our thoracic spine. Obviously, that's part of that scapulothoracic joint, right? So we have a structure here that's definitely going to influence scapular position. And very, very kind of simply, if we're in a more flexed position through our thoracic spine, we're usually going to have a more upward rotated position, right? So very, very simply, if my thoracic spine is flexed, my shoulders being convex concave, so we've got a concavity through here. You can see that curvature, and we've got a convexity, so an outward curvature then through that kind of thoracic cage. This is going to roll forwards on that thoracic position. So if I'm flexed, my shoulders are going to roll up and forwards. So I'm always going to be in a more upwardly rotated position. I'm always going to have that internal rotation then through that humeral head, and all of a sudden I'm still going to have that sort of disruption around that around my rotator cuff. Again, is this a rotator cuff problem? Probably not, right? It's probably actually thinking about thoracic cage. Well, my thoracic cage is compressed. It's all in that flexion position. My shoulders are naturally popped forwards. And actually the rotator cuff may well be perfectly fine. It might be in a little bit sort of disruption, might not know exactly kind of what it's doing, but fundamentally be all right. But actually what we need to do is change this position, and then all of a sudden we then get that function back again. So all of a sudden then we're talking about posture. How do we fix posture? And look, there are so many different caveats to this. Posture is a really multifactorial issue, but there's one really, really kind of simple kind of postural device that allows us to then reposition that scapula, reposition the glenohumeral joint, and actually allows us to then actually fire up that rotator cuff in a better way, allows us to then position that sort of postural process a little bit better. I refer to it as thumbs forwards. You know when you're in that sort of internally rotated position, you can see like thumbs pointing like in towards each other, right? Now that's internal rotation, right? So thumbs pointing in, that's an internally rotated position. Very, very kind of simply, when you sort of look at all our sort of anatomical charts, of which actually I don't have any in here, but you know what I mean. When you look at an anatomical model, thumbs are always pointing sideways, right? So they're pointing out to the side. So then they're in a more externally rotated position, right? So that's internal rotation, external rotation. So all of a sudden, all our anatomical models are walking around in an externally rotated position. Oh, that's a nice big sort of chest, and kind of sort of puts us posturally kind of quite well. And obviously, you'd look like a bit of a wally if you walked around with your hands out, palms forwards. So that's then where the thumbs forward sort of positioning sort of comes in. So we don't want to be internally rotated. We don't necessarily want to walk around externally rotated. You might want to, it's a personal choice. What we want to do is then come thumbs forward. So if we're thumbs forwards, all of a sudden, we externally rotate a little bit, right? So we can see this shoulder. I don't know why I'm holding this on. So we can see then this shoulder. So if I'm in internal rotation, you can see how it's popped in and forwards, right? If I go into full external rotation, you can see how instantaneously it's then popped back out into better posture. If I then kind of come thumb forwards, again, you can see I've got that good posture through there. If I pop myself back into that internal rotation, so thumb pointing in, you can see how it drops. So just bringing that thumb pointing forwards, all of a sudden, I can open up my pecs, I can tighten myself down at the back of my shoulder joint, and all of a sudden I can then find a better posture. Try it right now. Have a stand up, nice and kind of relaxed. Put yourself into a thumbs in position, so a kind of more internally rotated position. And you can feel how instantly you just drop into a much more passive sort of position. Doesn't feel right, doesn't feel active, doesn't feel good posture. Bring yourself into kind of palm facing forwards. All of a sudden you're like, that's lush. All of a sudden I can tighten everything down. That feels good. Shoulder blades kind of come back. My chest goes nice and big. I'm nice and upright, right? Now go thumb pointing forwards. You can still feel it's still exactly the same. It's slightly softer. It's slightly more controllable. And it's one of those things that you can then do all day, every day. So your postural check, thumb facing forwards. If it's facing forwards, I know that I can open up. I then just have to be a little bit more active posturally just to kind of hold myself there. So to recap, if you've got a shoulder injury or you're rehabbing someone with a shoulder injury, let's start to think about the entire complex rather than just mindlessly going and cracking on with our rotator cuff exercises. They definitely still have a place, but we've got to think about that complex as a whole. There are so many different moving parts and each one interacts and each one affects the other one. Don't forget the scapula is a massively significant component of that, and the thoracic position is a driver of that. It's not always about where it hurts. Sometimes it's about where it hurts and everything else around there. But that's us for this time. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe and comment below. Let us know your thoughts. See you next time.